The Cornelius, Oregon Church of Christ welcomes you. The Day of the Lord has several promises. Today, Brian Haines explores the Day of Judgment. Are you ready? This lesson was delivered on June 14th, 2026.
Well, we're certainly glad again, as always, to have our members here, but as well as having visitors here. We're always glad you're here and making the time to join us as we talk about the Word of God and try to make ourselves more profitable servants for God. This morning I want to talk about an idea that you could say is part of the four great prophecies of the New Testament. We talk about prophecy, we talk about the idea of something that was spoken of that was going to happen in the future. In the Old Testament, many, or if not most of the prophecies there are actually pointing to Jesus. And Jesus would tell us that he would fulfill all things that were spoken of him. In Luke chapter 24, Jesus said that it was necessary that he should die so that all things that were spoken of him could be fulfilled. We talk about Jesus, his birth and his ministry, his work, his death and his resurrection as being things that fulfilled these greatest of promises and prophecies. But by the time the New Testament had finished being written, there were four big prophecies that were both, you could say, in the process of being fulfilled or had not yet been fulfilled. Prophecies that are primarily spoken of in the New Testament. The first of these was one that, as the writers of the New Testament were finishing, they said was beginning. It's called the Great Apostasy. We take that word from 2 Thessalonians, where it speaks about this word apostasy, which means falling away. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul told the Thessalonians that before other prophecies would come to pass, this one would happen. John would say in 1 John chapter 2 that this prophecy was being fulfilled in that time period, and it was just beginning. The great apostasy, the great falling away. This was a New Testament prophecy that was spoken of. A second prophecy that actually, believe it or not, it did originate in the Old Testament but was emphasized by Jesus was the destruction of Jerusalem. It, in fact, is the substance of places like Matthew 24, Mark chapter 13, Luke chapter 22. It's something that Jesus talked about several times. The idea that Jerusalem would be destroyed as God's, I like the way it's put in Luke, as God's day of vengeance upon Israel and their unfaithfulness to him. And many times when people misunderstand some of the prophecies of the New Testament, they probably misunderstand some of the prophecies that speak about Jerusalem's destruction. There's a third prophecy that we don't talk about too much, but it actually began in the Old Testament, and at the time the New Testament was finished up, it still had not yet been fulfilled, and that is the destruction of Rome. Back in the book of Daniel, Daniel had seen the rise of Rome in prophecy. He had been described as this great and terrible beast with iron teeth, and he saw him also as, in part the idea of the statue that would be overcome by Christ. But the prophet Daniel wrote to us and told us that great empire, the fourth kingdom from his time, he described it as, would be overcome. And so the destruction of that empire, I say Rome, more generically speaking of the empire, hadn't yet to be fulfilled in the time of the finishing of the New Testament. The last prophecy is probably the one that we're the most interested in, because we could say that Jerusalem's been destroyed or was destroyed in its time, and Rome, that empire was destroyed, and the apostasy happened. But the last prophecy is the one that we're probably the most interested in. It is the prophecy of the great day of the end of all things. I'm going to come back to this in just a moment. Now, I tell you what, just as a tidbit, and I don't want to go too far on this, but I do think it's interesting, I would suggest to you that these four great prophecies are really what the book of Revelation is meant to cover. And I know that sometimes some people see it a little differently, but if you look at the chapters 1, 2, and 3 to the seven churches of Asia, they were falling away. 4 of the 7 churches, 5 of the 7 churches were falling away. 2 of them had actually already fallen away. The great apostasy seems to be a big part of that. And the language in chapters 6 through 10 seems to parallel very strongly Matthew chapter 24. And the language from chapters 11 through 18 seems to fall into line a lot with Daniel's prophecies about Rome. And of course, in chapter 20, we see how it is that the end of time seems to be spoken of there. And so a lot of times you think of what these great prophecies are. I'd suggest you probably the book of Revelation is really trying to bring those prophecies together for us to understand a little better. That's not what I want to talk about today. I just want to focus in on this last prophecy. That is to say, the destruction of the world, the last day. There are three things that the New Testament tells us about the last day, primarily using an expression several times to describe it. It is a day that comes like a thief in the night. Jesus says this in Matthew 24 and verse 44. Peter says this in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 10. And here you have Paul in 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 2 saying to the Thessalonians that you yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. The day of the Lord really is three things in the scriptures. Number one, it is the day that everything comes to an end. Everything that exists is destroyed. Peter puts it nicely in 2 Peter 3. He says it's the day when the heavens pass away with a great noise. The elements, he uses the word elements twice, the elements themselves, the atomic things, he says, are melt away with fervent heat. The earth and the works that it enter are all burned up. This creation was not built to last, and Jesus set a day that it will be destroyed. And that day of destruction is called the day of the Lord that comes like a thief in the night. But there's another way that that day is described, the same day but different events, and that is the day of resurrection. That is to say, the day when the dead shall rise. We see a lot spoken of about the resurrection in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Paul talks about it in chapter 5. He calls it the day that comes like a thief in the night. That's the day that's described as the dead coming up, arising. All the dead arising, being transformed, the Bible says, raised up and transformed. And that brings us to our third point, that this is the day of judgment. The day when Jesus will judge all men. Matthew 24 launches into the judgment on Israel and then moves forward into the judgment on all mankind. And Jesus will judge all men, the day of judgment. That's actually the thing I want to focus in on today in particular. I got some questions about this not too long ago, and they were good questions, and I kind of did a little study about this to kind of try to put together some thoughts, just some general things that we can think about, because day of judgment is something that is not easy to always understand. Somebody might say, well, what exactly is it that I'm looking for? You know, if you know there's a big test coming, you'd say, what's on the test, right? Well, that's what we want to know. What is the day of judgment? The day of judgment is like a test. And let me tell you, passing or failing means a lot more than any test you've ever taken. Where are you at? Believe it or not, the Bible wants you to know that you can know now what that test is going to look like and what's going to happen to you. But that's a good question. Somebody says, well, wait a second, I'm a Christian. What does that day mean for me? Good question. What does that day of judgment mean for those who are in Christ? And finally, a third part of this that comes up sometimes is how is it that on that day everything changes? The rewards that come with being a Christian. Here again are those passages that we see that tell us first and foremost that the day of judgment is a day that we don't have an understanding of when that will be. One of the great ways you can tell somebody is not teaching from the Word of God is when they tell you things like, well, there are signs of when it's going to be, or there are things that are indicating that. The Bible explicitly and clearly says that no one knows when that day is going to be. Some of us may be alive to see it. Some of us may die before them. The Bible, by the way, tells us it doesn't really matter. It happens to all of us. But the point is that the Bible wants you first and foremost to know that you should expect that there is no way to know. You should be ready for it at any time, because it can happen at any time. It can happen in the next 30 seconds. It can happen in the next 300 years. It's just unknown. In Revelation chapter 20, which I told you a moment ago seems to be addressing these things. There's a great verse that tells us this about the day. It says that as John is watching, he says, I saw the dead, small and great, standing before God, and books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works by the things which are written in the books. That last statement there is particularly important because it's one that we find repeated many times in the New Testament. What is it that we're being judged for? What is it that we are being judged for? The idea, of course, in Revelation 20 as well is that the day of judgment is the same for everybody. It's just not a time that we know it's going to be. We know that we're going to be resurrected in that judgment. That's the other thing that ties us to this. By the way, I'm hoping you're putting together some conclusions about this from these simple statements about what that day is like, but the Bible tells us we are to be resurrected on the day of judgment. And then in Revelation chapter 20, it talks about the examination. I would suggest perhaps he's trying to say it like this, that he says you're examined by the books, the book of life, the book of deeds, and first it's checked to see if you are in the book of life, and you might say that then ultimately we are examined for our deeds. I'll come back to this in a moment to understand this a little bit better. The day of judgment. It's interesting what the Bible tells us about what that judgment will look like. If you want, turn with me over to Matthew chapter 7 and verse 21. There Jesus was talking about what the day of judgment will look like for some. And Jesus says the following. In Matthew 7 verse 21, Jesus says, Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me, in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name? And I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. What's interesting about the judgment day, when the Bible talks about what we'll see, it first says we'll see a lot of surprise because a lot of people thought that they were okay. They thought they were ready for that day. And Jesus says many of people are going to be surprised because they're going to be told that they weren't. I think it's interesting. Years ago, a sister in Christ kind of made the point to me out of this. She said, it's interesting because it's not whether or not we know God, it's whether or not God knows us. And I thought, that is a great point because lots of people would say, well, I know God, I know Jesus, I know who he is, I know, he's well known to me. But the real question is, are you known to him? Now, we'll come back later to talk about how a person becomes known by God, but you might kind of gather just from the passage we read there, Jesus said, you practiced lawlessness, meaning you didn't do what I said to do. Well, I can see that that's probably applies to a lot of people who say, I love God, but do you do what God says? No, I think I'm okay. Otherwise, well, on that day, there's going to be a surprise. Jesus also said even for believers, though, those that are obedient, there's a bit of a surprise. For the sake of time, we won't read Matthew 25, but Matthew 25, verses 31 through 46 is a discussion of the day of judgment. Jesus says, I'm going to bring everybody before me in judgment. And he says then and by the way, this seems to be of my people, he describes the idea of saying, I'm going to look at them, I'm going to say, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me drink. You visited me when I was sick in prison. You might remember how those people that were found to be right before God said, we don't remember that. We didn't know that. And Jesus said, but if you did it for the least of your brethren, you did it for me. It's a surprise. I didn't realize, Jesus, that was, in fact, me being tested. I have to wonder sometimes if we're not tested a lot of times and don't appreciate that. In Hebrews chapter 13, the writer there talked about us being hospitable to others, and whether it's us welcoming others and such, and Jesus said the writer said you got to be careful because sometimes you're entertaining angels and you don't know it. I think that those kinds of tests are very, very likely. We're given opportunities all the time to serve each other and to do things for one another, and perhaps we don't appreciate it, but that's part of our test. So first and foremost, what will the judgment day look like? We're given a lot of hints as to what it's going to be and given some descriptions, particularly Matthew 25 gives us a strong description, but it's not exclusive. It's not the only thing we're being challenged for. We're being examined. Is my name in the book of life? Like I said, we'll talk about how that gets done. Have I put myself in a place where I have served God's people? That's going to be part of the test as well. Or was it the case I just called myself a believer, but I didn't obey Jesus? That's something you need to know about the day of judgment. But I want to move on, although I know we could talk more about this. I want to move on, and I want to say this. What about our judgment? What about our judgment? There's a little bit of confusion that comes up sometimes about this, because sometimes the Bible seems to say more than one thing about this. On the one hand, you might have a statement like 1 Peter 4 and verse 17, where Peter says, the time has come for judgment to begin in the house of God, the household of faith. James says something very similar in James 2 and verse 12, when he says that we will be judged by the law of liberty, by Christ. But then on the other hand, we also have statements where Jesus says something like this in John 5 and verse 24, most assuredly I say to you, he who hears my word and believes in him who sent me has everlasting life and shall not come into judgment. And I think it's fair to say that can be a little confusing. Are we going to be judged if we're in Christ? What's going to happen? Well, for one thing I want to say, it's maybe not always understood, but the Bible uses the word judge and judgment three different ways. There are three different ways that this word is used in the Bible. First of all, there's the way that is used that refers to the idea of making a judgment, a discernment between several things, in other words. The idea of looking at something and saying, is this what that is? We have to make judgments all the time. When you went this morning and you went to pull out the milk, did the milk smell funny? That was a judgment. If it smelled funny, you said, I put it back. Judgment. We make judgments every day. The Bible uses the word this way. You might think of like in Romans 2 and verse 12, it talks about being judged, the idea of Jesus and God rendering judgment on mankind. 1 Cornelius 6 and verse 2, Paul talks about us who are believers. He says, do you not know that the saints will judge the world, make discernment, make a division, a separation thereof? So there's that kind of judgment. This idea of a discernment. I'm going to suggest to you that may not necessarily be what the Bible speaks of when it talks about those who are in Christ being judged, but to some degree there could be some element of that involved for sure. Secondly, the Bible uses the word judge to describe when a choice is made, a verdict is given. A judge makes a judgment. I was watching something the other day where it was an Old West show, and the judge says, it's the judgment of this court that you're guilty and that you'll hang for this crime. That is a judgment, a judgment. And the Bible likes to use this idea, whether it's the idea of innocence or guilt, as a proclamation and the ultimate result of that proclamation. In ancient times, they called this a decision that comes from a judgment seat. And you see a nice expression of this like that in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10. We must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one, there it is very specifically, every one of us, each one of us may receive the things done in the body according to what he has done, whether good or bad. That second type of judgment is certainly the one that every person faces. An ultimate accounting by God, where God says, whether well done, good and faithful servant, or you failed, you wicked and lazy servant. That kind of is the concept here of this second type of judgment. Now, the third type of judgment is actually just a condemnation, a judgment that is condemnation. It seems probably that's a little bit of what is going on in Matthew 5 when Jesus talks about judge not, lest you would be the one to be judged. The language there speaks more to the idea of a condemnation that comes as judgment. You might think of 1 Corinthians 11 when he talks about taking the Lord's Supper. And he says, if you eat the Lord's Supper in an unworthy way, for he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats and drinks judgment. Some translations say condemnation or even damnation to yourself, not discerning the Lord's body. So sometimes judgment means the punishment that is rendered out. The Bible uses this word judge and judgment three different ways. And what we want to appreciate is that in a sense, all three do apply on the day of judgment, but perhaps not all three, or certainly not all three apply to everyone. I would say, for example, if you want to read along with me in Romans chapter 2, verses 5, 6, and 7, then in that sense, it's specifically using this terminology to describe the concept of God making determination. and ultimately rendering a verdict that gives a penalty or a reward. Romans chapter 2, verses 5, 6, and 7. In accordance with your hardness and your impenitent heart, you're treasuring up for yourself wrath in the day of wrath and revelation of righteous judgment of God, who will render to each one according to his deeds. That is actually quoting what was said before. Eternal life to those who by patient continuance in doing good seek for glory, honor, immortality, goes on to say, and destruction for those who do not. So here we have the Bible describing this idea of a day where God rewards those who are his and punishes those who are not. He makes a determination of guilt or, and we would say, innocence. But truth be told, that's already probably known. It's not as though God is saying, I wonder what's going on. It should already be known. And truthfully, it should be something that we ourselves have prepared ourselves to know. So I might say that in some ways, it's that on this moment that those things are finalized. You see, if you're in Christ, you've already begun to receive the inheritance. And if you're not in Christ and you're in sin, then you're already dead. And what we receive is the ultimate fruits of those things that we have already begun in our lives. We will be examined if we are in him, but the point is we will also be passing from condemnation. It is that third point of judgment that Jesus was particularly referring to when he said that those who are in him would pass out of judgment. Because elsewhere in that same book, he would talk about passing out of death and passing out of condemnation, much like the Apostle Paul would say in Romans chapter 8 and verse 1, when he says, therefore now no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus, who do not walk according to the Spirit, who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. Those who are in Christ pass out of condemnation. We are examined by God to verify that we are in Christ. Again, to be in Christ, to be in the book of life. Because I promise you all, you don't want to be accounted for your deeds. And that is the meaning of this type of judgment. Now, the third question that's put to me sometimes is, what about the rewards that are received? I hope you all understand that the punishment is eternal condemnation. That's hell. And it's forever, and it's described as darkness and torment. But the Word of God also describes that on the day of judgment that the saints receive a reward. It begins when we are raised from the dead and given a new body. That's the resurrection. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 says that we will meet Jesus in the air. I pause for a moment just to remind us that the Bible does not indicate Jesus will ever set foot on the earth again. When Jesus comes back, it's to end his authority. We talked about that just recently. And the Bible says that we are returned to the Father in heaven. We could say in that moment we are entering eternity. This transition, this transformation of resurrection is necessary. The Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that flesh and blood can't inherit the kingdom of God. We can't go to heaven as we are now. We have to be changed. That's the resurrection. And this is what we mean by the last day. Now, I want to make a point about that. You can probably have put this together yourself. If we are waiting to go to heaven for the resurrection, where a transformation must occur, then that must mean that nobody is yet in heaven, unless they've been resurrected and we didn't know it. And the answer is correct. That's what the Bible is suggesting. That's why the Bible says things like in John chapter 1, nobody's seen the Father except the Son. That's why Jesus says in John 14, I go and I'll prepare a place for you, and then I'll return and take you there. This is the language of the New Testament. I know lots of times we give ourselves comfort by saying, well, somebody's in heaven now watching down for us. And I'm certainly not going to be too critical of that, but to be completely clear, it's simply not the case. The Bible says nobody's in heaven yet. Nobody's in hell yet. Because ultimately, to inherit eternity, we have to have bodies that are changed, the Bible says. We have to be raised from the dead and transformed, the Bible says. Again, the entirety of 1 Corinthians 15 is trying to elaborate on that very specific subject. We're looking for the last day for Jesus to come. What is it that we're waiting for? Well, it's the inheritance. That's the most common term that's described about it. The term inheritance, the term reward is used oftentimes as well. For Colossians 3 and verse 24, I just grabbed it because it used both words, the reward of the inheritance. Meaning what? It means I get to live with God forever. I get to participate with God forever. It takes away all of the things that have made my life ugly and miserable, all the pain, all the heartache, all the sorrow. We sing songs like there are no tears in heaven. It reflects the idea that we have become total partakers in God's divine nature. Our reward is eternal life with God. Now the question is, and we actually asked this question in our recent Bible study on Saturdays, does that mean everybody gets the same reward? Well, I would suggest probably the easiest answer to that is to say yes, it does seem that we all receive the same reward. I understand that sometimes there are questions about this, but let's try to understand it like this. The apostles all said this was the reward they wanted, eternal life. They all acknowledged none of them deserved it or had earned it, even by the incredible things they had done. It was God's gift to them for their faithful service. That's the reward I want. That's what I'm looking for. It's the same thing they're looking for. Jesus gave us a great parable about this, the parable of the workers in the vineyard. In Matthew chapter 20, he described how workers came to a vineyard to work. The vineyard is the kingdom, Jesus would say, and we labor in the kingdom. He said some labored all day, others only labored for an hour, but at the end they all received the same reward. This seems to be what Jesus was trying to convey, that sense of we all receive the same reward. I've often said, though, the difficulty of that parable is that they received the wages. We're not receiving something we've earned because we have never come close to earning it. That parable would be more fitting if every one of them was given $1 million, $1 billion for a day's labor. That's what it is to receive eternal life. The labor that we put in now, the writers of the New Testament said often and repeatedly, is inconsequential compared to the glory that we'll receive for it. That's a big deal. That's a pretty exciting idea. Even in our best of imagination, we fail to appreciate just how great heaven's going to be. And that's something that I encourage everybody to use your imagination to consider, just how great it could be. This last day of judgment it has a lot of questions that I don't have answers to, that the Bible tells us we won't have answers to, such as when it will be. But we get a sense of what it's going to look like. What kinds of things are going to be going on and how God expects to render that judgment. And we have a good idea and sense of what we're going to be judged for. We're going to be judged for whether or not we're in the book of life and whether or not our deeds have kept us in the book of life. Because the Bible tells us we can have our name blotted out. And we have a good sense of what the reward is that we receive in Christ, and we have a good sense of what the punishment is if we are not. And I tell you right there, I would say we have enough information that whatever choices we want to make with our life, we're equipped to make the right one. Let's take a second and let's go in prayer to our Father. Would you join me for just a moment? Most holy God and Father in heaven, we come before you now and we give thanks to you, Father, for all the many blessings that you have given to us, particularly, though, that you have offered us an opportunity to have eternal life. And you've made it something that we can achieve, Father, that through your Son and his mercy and his grace and his truth and his law, that by following him, we can have these blessings. So, Father, we pray earnestly that, first of all, that everyone here that is in the book of life will, seeing this great joy that reward that we can have, strive to remain a part of the book of life. And secondly, Father, that those who might not yet be there might see from what your word has revealed the great blessing that there is to being there and the great fear there is for not. Help us to convey this to others, Father. Father, our question often is, how could anyone knowing these things not choose you? Father, help us to show others so that they might choose you. Walk with us in this week and let your great mercy forgive us of our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. In the name of Jesus, our Lord and Savior, we pray. Amen. You know, Peter makes a declaration about this that I've always thought is important. Peter had just finished talking about the end of all things in 2 Peter. He had said at the beginning of this, one of the big things that people in the world are going to say is they're going to say, well, things just keep going, so nothing's going to end. I think that's a pretty common feeling a lot of people have. A lot of people are struck with the idea that, things just seem to keep going on and on. They don't seem to stop. It doesn't seem like God's really that interested in what's going on, and they don't really believe that the end is coming. Well, I assure you the end is coming. Peter assures us. He said the only reason God is waiting is there's still some people that haven't yet obeyed him. God's not slack concerning his promises. He just desires that all will repent and come to him. Maybe one of the people that Peter was talking about is someone here this morning. But for every one of us here, since we consider that everything around us is one day going to be dissolved, we're going to be transformed, and we'll have an eternal destiny, and you can't avoid it. You're going to be rendered into an eternal being, and as such, you're going to go to one of two places eternally. Then what kind of person ought you to be? What kind of person ought you to be in holy conduct and in godliness? How does somebody get their name in the book of life? The Word of God tells us, and this is again not the teaching of man but of God, that if a person believes that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, having heard that from the Word of God, and confesses that Jesus is Lord from that belief, turns away from sin, dies to sin, and is buried in Christ in baptism. The Word of God says that when a person arises from that, they arise clothed in Christ, having been baptized into his death, his burial, and resurrection. They arise and they are children of God. To be an inheritor of something, you've got to have the right name, right? I don't expect that whenever I saw recently that a multi-billionaire, they said, became the world's first trillionaire just recently. I'm not going to be in his will. I don't have the same name. But I'm going to be in God's will because I put on the name of his Son, Jesus, in baptism. And that promised me an inheritance as long as I remain clothed in Christ. In Revelation chapter 16, there's a neat little tidbit that says, don't be the person that removes your garment in the world and then your shame is exposed. It's removing your name from the book of life. You got to abide in me, Jesus said in John 15 verse 4. You got to abide in my doctrine. You got to stay with me to the end. And in the end, you get that great reward. It's a terrible thing to think about the idea of Jesus' parable of the workers in the vineyard and say that there might have been somebody who worked for 10 hours and then say, you know what, this is too hot, I'm going home. Did they get paid at the end? No. Because only those, Jesus said, who are faithful to the end receive the crown of life. So this morning, we take every time we get together as an opportunity to encourage each other, to remind each other, stay faithful to the end. Your work has a great reward ahead of you, something that's so incredible you can't even totally imagine it. There aren't words. Paul said words can't describe. When he saw heaven in 2 Cornelius chapter 12, he says that words can't even describe it. That's how incredible it is. And we take the same understanding of that torment that's also indescribable. Make your calling sure, Peter says in 2 Peter chapter 1. And that's the invitation we offer every time that we're together. Is there something you're struggling with in your life that your name is in the book of life, but you're struggling to keep it there? You know what? One of the things the church is charged to do is to bear one another's burdens. We'd sure love to help you with that, to pray with you, to encourage you, to walk with you. But maybe you're the person I mentioned this morning that is the person God is waiting for to repent. And you're the person God desires to become faithful. And if that's the case, well, here's what you need to do to get your name in the book of life. We're always willing to talk to somebody after services. We can sit down and visit with you, study with you. Sometimes people say, no, I know what I need to do and I'm ready to do it right now. If I'm describing you, why don't you come up here and visit with me while we stand and we sing a song to encourage.
Thank you for joining the Church of Christ in Cornelius, Oregon. We can be found on our website. You can scan the QR code on your screen or the CD you were given, or on Facebook at facebook.com/Cornelius Church of Christ. Thank you and God bless.